the recording. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our webinar, Local Guidelines for Resilient, Efficient, and Affordable Buildings. I'm Brooks Winter, and I'm Senior Clean Energy Specialist at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. I'm joined today by my colleague, Sasha Scheideroff, a Senior Clean Energy and Climate Planner, who will be helping moderate the webinar today. We've got a great agenda for you. We'll start with some housekeeping and an introductory poll, and then give an overview of the guidelines and how they were developed. Then we'll have a stellar panel of local officials who helped craft the guidelines and who will share their insights about how they're planning to use their guidelines to encourage sustainable and affordable development locally. Then we'll take questions from you in the audience before wrapping up at 1 p.m. sharp. Just some housekeeping quickly. Would encourage you all to keep yourself on mute when you're not talking. You can use the chat feature to ask questions. We're going to have the Q&A section after the presentations and the panel. And if you'd like to rename yourself in Zoom with your name and your organization or community and your affiliation. And we'd love to get to know our audience a little bit more. So Sasha is going to pull up an intro poll for us before we dive in. So please let us know who you are and kind of what demographic you're representing by filling out the poll. Are you all seeing a poll? Is that working? Okay. So you want to give folks another few minutes or a few seconds to fill it out and then publish the results? Oh, great. Awesome. So we can see this in live time here.
I think I might have reshared it. So
oh, sorry about that.
Apologies for that. Yeah, and then it restarted it. But we had a good amount in the first round of it. I think it was about 30% municipal staff, elected officials, some who are committee and board members, and then others from nonprofits and community-based organizations. So thank you all. I think we both hit end poll at the same time, so might have not allowed everyone to see the results, but thank you for introducing yourselves through that.
Thanks, Sasha. Great. So for those of you not familiar with MAPC, we're the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, the regional planning agency for Metro Boston, serving the 101 cities and towns of our region on the map there. And our clean energy department works to support a just transition to clean energy through smart local and regional planning, policy, and project technical assistance. And the guidelines which we're launching today were developed as part of the the Melrose, Malden, and Medford Building Resilience, Efficiency, and Affordability Project. MAPC worked with these three neighboring communities to collaboratively develop sustainable and resilient design guidelines for residential and mixed-use developments and retrofits to encourage developers to build affordable housing that is energy efficient and climate resilient. And this work was supported with a grant from the Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Action Grant Program. So what are the guidelines? So they're intended, as I mentioned, for residential and mixed use new development and retrofit projects. And we see them as a part of a toolkit for advancing the stock of energy efficient, affordable, and resilient living spaces throughout the region and in these communities. And housing developers should use them in tandem with local ordinances and the state building codes, and in coordination with their local building, planning, and sustainability departments. And I think these kinds of guidelines are important because our communities are dealing with multiple crises at the same time, namely, in this case, our regional housing crisis and the global climate crisis. And they were also developed with input from community members through a series of interviews, focus groups, and workshops, which we'll talk about on the next slide. So they're informed by the communities that they're designed to serve. And we also know that creating incentives for developers to instill these practices will be key to encouraging implementation and including, in addition to the voluntary guidelines that we've created. I mentioned that community engagement. Over the course of the last year and a half or so, we conducted 11 interviews with stakeholders and community-based organizations, 2 focus groups with community members across all 3 communities, a number of conversations one-on-one with developers, and then 2 stakeholder workshops to discuss the draft guidelines, one at the beginning of the project and one once we had a near final version of the guidelines. So what's in the guidelines? We're going to give you a quick preview today of the guidelines that we developed, and then we'll share a copy on our website and with anyone who registered for the webinar today. They're broken into 4 sections. So there's a section on energy measures, a section on mobility and transit access, a section on climate resilience, and then a separate section at the end on project resources and incentives. Though I'll note that we tried to sprinkle in useful links and resources throughout the guidelines about the incentive programs available or different tools that teams can use to evaluate climate vulnerability, for example, and we'll point out where some of those are. So the energy measures section includes guidance and recommendations about energy efficiency, green building certifications, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, or HVAC, renewable energy and energy resilience, and then utilities and energy burden and ways to minimize energy burden for residents. And just a couple examples of recommendations in the guidelines. One is that project teams are encouraged to pursue a green building certification, such as Passive House, Enterprise Green Communities, or LEED, or Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, to help maximize energy performance and minimize waste while creating a healthy indoor environment. And then another one specific to utilities is that project teams are encouraged to consider how the project will minimize energy cost burdens for residents. In the mobility and transit access section, there are recommendations about walkability and mobility and connectivity to community resources, accessibility, bike parking and bike share, car parking, and electric vehicle or EV charging. A couple examples from that section. Projects are encouraged to provide convenient pedestrian access and information about the proximity of key community sites and resources such as transit hubs, grocery stores, downtown districts, and recreation areas. And projects are also strongly encouraged to provide ample bike racks and protected storage for residents and visitors. So then there's the resilience measures section, and that includes recommendations and guidance on urban forests and trees, sustainable roofs, stormwater management, permeable surfaces, and rain gardens and bioswales. This is an example of a rain garden. And one example of a recommendation from that section, project teams are encouraged to evaluate the vulnerability of the project to extreme weather and climate change impacts such as heat or flooding. And this is one of the areas in the guidelines where we included a list of resources and tools for assessing climate vulnerability. There's the Massachusetts Clearinghouse for climate change information and resilience info. There's including their climate resilience design standards tool. MAPC has a climate vulnerability index tool, which is this map here on the right. And Lisk Boston and New Ecology just published a really helpful resilient design brief, which is also a great supplemental resource. And then, yeah, finally, the guidelines end with a list of resources that includes links to MassSave's website and pages for their passive house incentive and their new construction incentives, information about the incentives for solar through the Massachusetts SMART or Solar Massachusetts Renewable Target Program. A couple years ago, MAPC put together a matrix of clean energy programs targeted at low and moderate income residents that might be useful. And the National Housing Trust has put together some information about federal funding resources, including those included in the new Inflation Reduction Act passed last year. So we tried to make these as actionable and useful, both as an educational tool and as guidelines that developers should refer to. So that's the summary of what's in the guidelines. We wanted to make that fairly brief so that we have plenty of time today to hear from our panel. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second and ask Sasha to highlight our panelists. So we're joined by Lori Massa, senior planner from the city of Melrose, Martha Grover, the sustainability manager from the city of Melrose as well. Danielle Evans, a senior planner with the city of Medford, and Alicia Hunt, the director of planning and community development in Medford, as well as Nelson Miller, the building commissioner from Malden, and Emily Granoff, the newly minted sustainability manager from the city of Malden as well. So we've got a great panel. We're going to ask them a series of questions about the guidelines. And if you have questions about the guidelines, feel free to start putting those into the chat, or if you think of questions for any of our panelists as we move through the panel, please feel free to drop those in the chat as well. Great. Well, hi everyone. Good to see you all. I am going to ask the first question, maybe starting with you, Martha. So why was Melrose, or why was your community interested in working on this topic, and how does it fit in with other climate and community development goals and priorities locally?
Thanks, Brooks. We were really pleased to have this opportunity to participate in this project because it kind of came at the same time that we had a lot of other balls in the air that were related, and putting together, creating some green building design guidelines, really put into one package a tool and some real concrete information that is in support of our, one of our top 4 MVP priorities that came out of our MVP process, to develop green infrastructure and green buildings and support that in our community. And at the same time, at the same time that this opportunity came along, we were working on our net zero action plan, which of course for a city like Melrose, over 60% of our emissions come from our building sector. We also had in place, or we're working on a housing production plan and some zoning incentives that Lori can speak to, and then knew that the stretch code was coming. So it was just an opportunity to put into one document some support and help to developers who are building in Melrose, and then the opportunity to work with our neighbors in Malden and Medford to learn from each other, and to collaborate on this was also just really great.
Awesome. Thanks, Martha. And Lori, anything you want to add there from your perspective in the planning office?
Sure. As Martha mentioned, we worked on incentive zoning 2 years ago to create a way for projects to include more green building design, and then get a return for it. So with providing a list of things like high performance building envelopes and insulation, electrification, air and ground source heat pumps, green roofs, solar panels, electric vehicle charging infrastructure in 2 of our business and transit oriented districts. You can provide an increased, you can have an increased FAR and height, and also some alternatives for providing open space in creative ways to have some real functional outdoor space, as opposed to kind of some of the leftover strips of land that are often counted as open space in zoning. So we've seen this zoning put into place already. We have 3 projects that have been permitted using this tool, and 2 others that are coming soon. So it's been a success. And we also have recently completed a housing production plan, and there's a strategy to encourage sustainable development through siting and design of new housing, and then an action to create baseline requirements for sustainable development, as well as provisions for on-site green infrastructure. So these guidelines address those 2 projects directly. So it's been great to work on, and we're excited to put them into action.
Yeah, that's great. And I love the themes there that you touched on, Lori and Martha, of sort of these guidelines touching multiple different plans and also really fitting into a suite of policies like the incentive zoning that you're using. And yeah, I think that's a really great example of working on housing and climate issues at the same time. Anyone from Medford or Malden want to take that question about, how this fits in with your climate community development goals and priorities? Nelson.
Yeah, I can just say similar to what Martha and Laurie said. This is good timing for the city of Malden, because we have a couple initiatives going on as well, which are geared towards efficiency and sustainability. One of them is a specific commission that was put together by one of our city councilors that includes some residents as well as our public facilities director, and it's geared towards efficiency and sustainability for strictly city-owned properties, buildings, and open space. So they can kind of focus on improvements, for the most part, improvements. We're not building anything at the moment, but for the most part, improvements to those city-owned buildings. And then aside from that, we have Green Malden, which Emily is extremely involved in, which is more of a holistic approach to sustainability through green building and stormwater and hazard mitigation and things like that. So I think that this coming along at this time is going to be beneficial to both of those different groups as they kind of work through the different criteria that they're looking at citywide.
Great. Thanks, Nelson. Danielle, I see you come off mute there. You want to take this one too?
I just want to echo the others on the panel that about the timing. The timing is really great for Medford as well. We recently completed our first comprehensive plan, a housing production plan, and then our climate adaptation plan, action and adaptation plan. And so, and we're also on the cusp of multiple phases of rewriting our zoning. So we had a small kind of recodification of our zoning, and now we're entering into like a second phase of implementing our comprehensive plan and the climate action plan. And a lot of what we want to do is reference these guidelines to, as like Lori was saying, to develop incentives, because guidelines are nice and we can give those to developers and they can say, okay, you like these things, we'll do it. But it's nice to associate that with some kind of bonus or benefit that incentivizes the developer to do these things. So I'm hoping that as we develop our zoning, and it'll likely also be coming quickly and on the heels of us writing our MBTA zoning overlays that we need to do, incorporating these incentives into that new zoning that we're required to do.
Yep.
To not to further our climate goals as well.
Yeah, that's great, Danielle, and encouraged to hear you and Lori and Melrose both talk about the possibility of combining these guidelines with incentive zoning, and I think one of the things that we aimed to do at the outset of this project was basically just to help you all define what you mean if you say we want in a housing production plan or a climate action plan, we want to encourage sustainable building development. What does that mean? And if a developer comes to you and says like, sure, like I'm all for sustainable development, but what do you mean? These guidelines help spell that out. So great. I might go back to you, Danielle, for the second question, which is there a specific issues that the guideline or a specific issue that the guidelines cover that you're particularly excited about or that feels particularly relevant for you right now?
I like that the guidelines take a real holistic approach. In the beginning of this project, it seemed that it was a narrow framework of just focusing on the design of the physical structure of the building. But I like that it's been expanded to incorporate the site plan and where these buildings are in general throughout the built environment, because you can have the most energy efficient building, but if it's car dependent and has a lot of hardscape, it starts to kind of negate some of the building efficiency. So I feel like it has to be tackled from all angles. And I like that it kind of had a menu of different ways to take on the challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And I as someone who is mainly focused on clean energy, I think that's one of the real strengths as well, that holistic approach. We talk about resilience and stormwater, green building features like all electric heating and cooling, walkability, transit access, all of those issues covered in one set of guidelines, I think is a really exciting and kind of intersectional approach to them. Other issues that folks are excited about that we cover in the guidelines?
I would say that in Melrose, a lot of our new development over the last couple of years has already been proposed as all electric. So with heat pumps and other electric equipment. So I think that, as Danielle said, the more holistic approach to looking at the full building or development aspects and responding to what we heard from the people that we talk to, our residents and others, the focus on adding more green space and really paying attention to that component of the projects and putting that in the guidelines was important. Going beyond, say, you know, the new stretch energy code requirements and looking at it, you know, providing more context and more definitive requirements, what we're looking for. In
Yeah,
those
and
aspects.
that's great. And I think, you know, we'll talk a little bit later about some of the ways that we got input from the community and engaged community members. But I think that was one thing that we heard loud and clear from people is that, you know, we need more green space, particularly when we're thinking about climate resilience. There are so many benefits of trees and yeah, adding green space to our communities. And that's something that folks really wanted. Nelson, any issue that you're particularly
Yeah, I
enthused
was just
about?
gonna say that, you know, obviously the broad scope of this is great. I can't help but be the building official here and say that I like the energy efficiency stuff.
Yep.
Because our community, I think the biggest impact we have is on our existing housing stock. And I like the idea of incentivizing, you know, heating efficiencies, heat pumps, ventilation, building envelope upgrades. I think that's the best way to make the largest impact across the board on existing homes as well as new construction. But it's good to have diversity of the different options so that different properties can have, you know, might have different options than others.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Nelson. And Nelson, I'll go back to you and then maybe to some of the planners on our panel here to talk about how the guidelines are going to be used and integrated into your development processes locally. So can you talk a little bit about that first, Nelson?
Yeah, sure. Going back to the two groups I'd spoken about, you know, I think that our energy efficiency and sustainability commission can certainly put these guidelines to use as they continue to review existing city buildings, existing city properties, and propose changes and upgrades to those properties. I think that's, you know, the extremely useful for them as they work through that. On the efficiency thing, you know, it's been brought up a few times. The stretch energy code is a huge thing. We're all stretch communities, and we have a specialized stretch energy code now, which as a city, we're going to start to take a look at, speak to city council, speak to the public, and get some awareness out there of you know, what really needs to everybody, and then look at some form of adoption to that down the road. So I think that's going to be a pretty substantial change for us, as well as, you know, most of the cities in Massachusetts who decide to adopt it. With the Green Malden portion, I'm gonna defer to Emily on that because I know that she's much more involved in that entire group than I am, and how we can implement these ideas.
Yeah, so Green Malden, as Nelson mentioned earlier, is the city of Malden's effort to take an all of government approach to addressing climate change, looking at how every city policy and program impacts climate change, either from a mitigation or a harm reduction perspective, right? How can we lessen our impacts on the causes of climate change, or how can we be prepared for the impacts of climate change? And we're in the middle of a climate action plan right now to really lay out a roadmap for how we're going to accomplish that. And these guidelines, for that reason, as everyone was saying earlier, come at a really good time, because we can look at taking them through the climate action plan process and saying, one of the things the city needs to do is to look at how to engage in conversation with developers with this resource that we have. Like, how can we sit down with people and say, this is a list of things that we think are really great ideas. Which one is workable for your project?
Yeah, that's great, Emily. And I love what you and Nelson touched on there, which is that the city is really leading by example here. You're going to be, you know, using these guidelines for your own building projects, and then also using them in those conversations that you're having with developers. Yeah, Lori.
Yeah, in Melrose, we plan to put a reference to these guidelines on our application forms for zoning approval and also on the building inspectional services page so that people are aware of them. And there's so many different kinds of people that look at these applications, from homeowners to architects, builders, contractors. So to really kind of get the word out there that they exist and that the city is encouraging these things. So we'll get the word out that way. And then also with the incentive zoning that we've already created, there'll be a direct connection with kind of going through the guidelines and having a discussion with developers about what they're including and what they're not including and why. And it's a focused way of kind of going through, as Danielle mentioned, a very comprehensive look at a variety of options and ways of developing kind of a sustainable project.
Yeah, that's great, Lori. And I think you touched on something important there, which is that, you know, there are requirements at the local level, like your zoning and the statewide building codes, for example. And these guidelines are really designed to complement what is required and encourage developers to think about things, to look at them, and to at least ask themselves, is this feasible, or what are the risks at my site that I should be keeping in mind? So yeah, I think from that perspective, a useful conversation starter and or thought inspiration mechanism for developers. Yeah, Danielle?
So our long-term goal for using this, like I said earlier, was to inform our incentive zoning provisions that are not written yet and could take, quite a long time to get approved. So thinking that, the short-term way that we could use these guidelines would be to, start these conversations with developers. You give them these, very digestible, succinct document versus a several hundred page climate action plan and say, read this to figure out what we want. So I think this could, be a good conversation starter, like when we have meetings with developers about what our expectations are and what we would like to see.
Yeah, I mean, that's you raised a good point there too, Danielle, which is that the guidelines are not very long. They're 9.5 pages, 10 pages. So we wanted them to be fairly short and digestible, and useful both as an educational tool and a conversation starter and a complement to some of the other policies that are that your communities are either have in place currently or are looking at, like the incentive zoning. Great. So one last question from me, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. As I mentioned before, the guidelines were developed with input from the community, and we had community engagement was an important piece of this program. So can you talk a little bit more broadly about how your teams or your staff are working to engage your communities in conversations about housing, climate, and other key issues that the guidelines touch on? Emily, maybe I'll pick on you first with that one, because you're in the middle of some of these conversations, and we're having them with community members just the other weekend, I know.
Yes, this past 2 weekends ago now, actually, we did launch our climate action plan at an Earth Day event for the city. And our plan for the first 6 months or so of that process is to do some really deep and thoughtful community engagement. And we're focusing on ways we can engage groups who don't always interact with government on a regular basis. Folks with limited English proficiency, minority groups, low income groups, looking at how we can take the things that we need feedback on and bring them to places those populations are already at and say, here's a brief but comprehensible explainer in words and language that makes sense to you about what this issue is. And here is the question that we're looking to answer. Do you have thoughts? Do you have concerns we're not seeing here that should be informing the way we approach this problem? So that's sort of the climate piece. And on the housing piece, there are other people in my office who could speak better to this, I know, but we're in the middle of some other conversations about projects like an affordable housing overlay, which would make it easier and more streamlined to build affordable housing projects throughout the city of Malden. Because one thing we know is that a huge number of our residents are cost burdened. They spend more than 30% of their income on their rent or mortgage. And so housing and climate together are really two huge priority issues for Malden communities. And there's something that people want to talk to us about. It's our job to just make that as easy for them as possible.
Yeah, that's great, Emily. And I love what you said there about making these conversations accessible and comprehensible. And I think that was something that we saw through the course of this project. And as we were doing community engagement, energy efficient building design or climate resilient building design can be very wonky topics. And when you're getting into specific specs or, the details, I think it's easy to lose people. But when we say, we're here to talk to you about how your community can build more housing to make housing affordable and ensure that it's green and that it includes green space or access to transit hubs and other, and that the homes of the future will not be so expensive to heat or light that you can't afford to live there. Like, I think that really resonated. So I love how you're sort of taking that and building it into your local planning processes. Alicia, I'm gonna throw it over to you next. We haven't heard from you yet, but thanks for being here and would love to hear your thoughts on how Medford is engaging in some of these conversations.
Oh, sure. I was actually thinking about one of the questions in the chat would be a good one for me to answer. I don't know if Danielle, were you prepared to answer about how Medford's engaging?
Engaging the public regarding the
in general. So, and I can speak to that. I wasn't sure if you were expecting to answer that one. Medford's been doing a lot of outreach around our comprehensive plan, our housing production plan, climate plan. The city's actually done something very different. We have been working with our Office of Outreach and Prevention on how to best engage underrepresented populations.
Yep.
And so we have put together a program called Community Liaisons and Medford Connectors. And these are people, we went out and made an effort to hire people who were in the community already, who represent underrepresented populations in Medford, and bring them on as staff to then work between us and to help engage how we do our outreach, how to inform that, but also some of them hold focus groups themselves, hold regular meetings themselves with the populations. Right now we have Haitian, Brazilian Portuguese speaking, a Spanish speaking connector, Arabic. We just brought on a Chinese language connector, somebody who's, I'm afraid that I can't off the top of my head say which 3 Chinese languages he's fluent in. And then someone from our African-American population, with the idea that it helps us if they can inform us better about cultural norms, how and when to reach people. For example, I held a Haitian focus group on a Friday afternoon. We never hold public meetings on Friday afternoon, but the Haitian connector said to me, this is a good time for the people in my community. If you hold it on 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon, or maybe 4 o'clock, I can get people to come to that. And so in this way, trying to better understand the mechanisms, and we did it in a park. And we had gift cards, and it was just sort of a different format than we would normally do a public meeting in order to better engage the different underrepresented communities who we've been trying to inform about everything. And we're trying to roll that out in all the engagement that we do, and not just the, is this about energy? Is this about environment things? So.
I love that, Alicia, and those connector positions sound awesome. I know, Emily's team in Malden is doing some similar work around their climate action plan in particular. But yeah, I think, meeting people with where they are is a little bit of a cliche at this point, but it sounds like you were actually doing that, going to the park and picking a time that worked for the community that you were trying to connect with. So yeah, that's great. Any last thoughts on that engagement question, or should we move to questions from the audience? Okay. Great. So Alicia, sorry, that was a great answer, even though I put you on the spot. You were volunteering to answer a different question from the chat. Do you want to go ahead with that?
Sure. I noticed the first question that popped up was about applying these guidelines to municipal buildings. And I think it's really important that municipalities lead by example. And as a general rule, zoning, et cetera, applies to municipal buildings too. However, I think it's also important for people to realize that municipal greenhouse gases, we did a study in Medford. We actually do our greenhouse gas inventory every year. And municipal buildings count for 3%, or municipal greenhouse gases, buildings and our transportation from our vehicles together is 3% of the municipality's greenhouse gases. So when we are really trying to move the dial and move the needle on energy, on greenhouse gases, on the environment, particularly around greenhouse gases, municipal buildings, that's great. We just built a net zero library and an all electric police station. But really our bang for the buck is about looking at the new developments coming in and the new buildings. That's where we can have a lot of influence and actually make a big difference. We're particularly seeing demand from life science buildings, and those can be very heavy energy users. And so I think it's really important that we have an awareness of how those buildings affect our greenhouse gases in particular. And I just should say, I'm our director of planning, but I was previous to that our director of sustainability, energy, and environment for 7 years. So I know of which I speak in this area.
Yes, very, very true. Thanks, Alicia. Yeah, so I hear both Medford and Malden saying, you guys are leading by example, and I know that Melrose is too. So that's great. So we had a question in the chat about whether your communities are receiving any pushback or pressure to deal with unintended consequences or the increase in housing values. And I'll just note quickly, there is a section in the guidelines specifically about the cost for things like passive house design. Martha, you mentioned that all electric construction is quickly becoming kind of the common practice, the standard in Melrose. We've also, MAPC has hosted a series of conversations with developers to get their particularly, both affordable housing and market rate developers to get their perspectives on developing green buildings. And what we've heard particularly in the affordable housing space is that passive house design has become the standard there. And we actually just co-hosted a webinar last month with Mass Housing about that. We can drop a link to that in the chat. But any thoughts about those unintended consequences or any pushback that you've received from folks in conversations in your communities?
I can start us off on this one. I think conversations I'm seeing are not so much pushback as concern that we make sure that any implementation of these guidelines isn't used to sort of prevent the development of more affordable housing because it becomes cost prohibitive.
Yep.
it's not, we don't want this to happen. It's, we want to do this carefully and make sure that, you know, we ramp up the requirement to it as things become more affordable, so that we're implementing these policies without that negative consequence of making it really expensive in the short term.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that was a focus of this project from day one. It's why affordable and resilient and efficient are all included in the title of the project. And yeah, glad to hear, Emily, that Malden is you know, trying to move on housing and climate goals as complementary and not conflicting. Any other thoughts on that question? Sasha, go ahead, Martha.
Well, my thought on it is that, you know, one of the outcomes of this and of the community outreach that we did, where we were appealing to both the sectors, residents and others in our community who are concerned about affordable housing and also concerned about sustainability and green building, and bringing those two together and to hear and listen to each other and to acknowledge that green doesn't always mean more expensive. I mean, if we're building highly efficient buildings that have a smaller energy load at a 1 to 2% premium, construction premium, that the end goal could be lower operating and, you know, energy burden to the residents. We've got to see more examples of that. And you know, it's hard also to make the case when we're in an environment of these crazy electricity prices, and we're still in this transition of, you know, all of that evening out over the next few years. But we need to bring both sectors, but you know, everybody together to kind of to show and talk about how we can do both. We can be responsible to climate and also create affordable housing. It's happening across the state, and we can do it here as well.
Great. Thanks, Martha.
And I'll just quickly add too that the, you know, benefit of having a requirement through zoning is that you can allow for more development to offset some of the costs of you know, installing and having these green infrastructure that, you know, sometimes have increased costs. Some of the things in the guidelines though don't require, you know, more money. If you're changing entrances to make things more pedestrian friendly, or, you know, some of the strategies in there don't cost more money. It's just sometimes people don't think about these things as they're doing their site plans and building designs. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, thanks, Lori. We had a couple questions in the chat about the stretch code and the specialized stretch code. One audience member was wondering where each of your communities are at with that, and whether you're considering adopting the specialized code. And then there was also a question about how the guidelines are designed to to work with the energy code. So Nelson, you mentioned Malden is considering the specialized code. You haven't adopted it yet, correct? But you're in the process of analyzing that for your community. Is that correct?
Yeah, Malden is a stretch energy community. So the recent changes to the stretch energy code obviously are being adopted. The residential low-rise portions were effective January 1st, and then the commercial end of it will be coming into effect July 1st of this year. The specialized stretch energy code is the new one. This is, I think I said to Emily the other day, the energy code is the perfect combination of boring and confusing. The specialized stretch energy code actually is something that each city and town has to adopt. It's not an automatic as our current stretch energy code is. And the state, between the DOER and the DBRS, have actually recommended not adopting it until after July 1st, even closer to the end of this calendar year for each city and town. So the city of Malden's decided that the mayor has been very involved in it and has asked that we, make sure we get all the information out to the city council and to the residents, so everyone's aware of what the impacts are, and then put it through a public process like it has to go through and get it done by the end of the year.
Great. Thanks, Nelson.
I would just add, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
That we did specifically design the guidelines, as Brooke said, to be to complement the code. Obviously, we wouldn't put anything in the guidelines that would be in conflict with the stretch code. So there's in the updated code, there are things around like EV readiness. And so the EV portions of the guidelines sort of complement that, but don't get into the same level of specificity that the building code does.
Great.
Yeah,
Thanks.
in Melrose, we have a new building commissioner, so we're letting him get some time here under his in his new position before we get into the specialized looking into adopting that. But I expect that we will eventually.
Great. Thanks, Martha. And maybe a related question, is there a way to integrate these guidelines into the decision-making processes for local planning boards when considering special permits? Anyone want to take that?
I can take that. Melrose has incorporated the green building and sustainable design into our zoning ordinance, and so therefore projects that need site plan approval or special permits, there can be specific findings that the boards need to make in order to grant those approvals. I've also just found that planning and zoning board members being aware that these guidelines exist, they're more likely to ask developers about them during the public hearings, and sometimes that in and of itself gets the message out there that these things are important to Melrose. And as we see new applications coming in, they are incorporating things from the start, knowing that the boards are going to be asking about this, and it comes up from the public as well during the public hearings.
Great. Yeah. And I imagine, having these posted on the city's website or something like that, a developer that's smart and planning ahead will look at them and see what's on there in terms of either the requirements or guidelines like these, and start building those in from the start. Great. So I think that covered most of, we had a question about resources and particularly federal and state grants. I mentioned that the guidelines have information about those kind of sprinkled throughout. But I'll also say that if there are any developers in the room who are interested in these topics, LISC Boston, New Ecology, and the Mass Association of Community Development Corporations, or MACDC, host an energy cohort, which meets roughly every other month, I think, and is a great place to connect with peers about a lot of the topics included in the guidelines, to learn more and to hear what others are working on. So we'll just put in a plug for that group as well. Sasha, any other questions that we should cover before we wrap up? It's getting close to 1 o'clock.
I see a hand raised. Darren?
Hello, sorry about that.
Yes.
Hello.
Darren Costa.
Yes. Sorry about that.
Quick question.
Yes, thank you so
wrap?
much. Yes, please. I'm the Ward 3 City Councilor in Everett, and I just want to thank you all for educating myself and others on how to approach solving some of these complex environmental issues. So I just wanted to kind of high level, how did you establish kind of collaboration across legislators, administration, department heads, and planning boards? Like, what framework did you consider around establishing like feedback and roles and milestone phasing? I know someone earlier had mentioned that they phased milestones of amended ordinances throughout a period of time. Just as a background, Everett does require multiple ordinance, district mapped, and building dimension changes. We're very early in establishing green initiatives and development requirements. Thank you.
Yeah, great question, and thanks for being here, Darren. Any thoughts on that kind of process question about integrating across departments and sort of getting everybody on the same page to make these kinds of things happen? Maybe I'll pick on Malden. So it seems like the Green Malden initiative is a good example. Emily, you guys, and particularly through the Climate Action Plan, have a sort of a department heads meeting. You want to talk about how that's working?
Sure. I am happy to talk about it in the Green Malden context. The only thing I will throw out there is that I can't talk about that to this specific project as well, but I'm going to take a flyer and say I think a lot of the same principles still applied. Because basically the way that we're handling sort of internal coordination for the Climate Action Plan is that we have an internal sustainability working group, which is made up of a lot of different department heads and then individual staff like myself, who have a really strong nexus to climate in our work. So that would be like me, the sustainability and grants manager, our senior planner and policy manager, the transportation planner, and then a number of department heads, including Nelson, our engineering director, director of the health department. And we get together and go over both what is going on in the planning process to keep everyone up to date and get their feedback on, what is your department doing? What's working really well? What could we be doing to better interface between departments on these different climate issues? When we redo a road, sometimes neighbors see more rat activity that gets reported to the health department. And a lot of this comes down to making the time to have the conversation, everyone getting on the same page about, this is a priority for the city and for our residents. So we need to make the time to have the conversation. And then doing the legwork, right? You need to organize the meeting and take notes and do the follow-up. I actually owe Nelson and other members of that group a follow-up email from our last meeting. But you just need to have someone who owns that and can put in the work to make sure it's running smoothly.
That's great. Well, that was a great question to end on, I think. And yeah, so just quickly before we wrap up here, we have a couple of resources. So as I mentioned, a template version of the guidelines are going to be posted on MAPC's website soon. We'll send them out to everyone who registered along with a recording. But two resources I wanted to just quickly mention. One is MAPC's Municipal Net Zero Playbook, which provides a great foundation for communities that are looking to do local climate action planning, and then the climate resilient land use strategies toolkit that we have on our website as well. Really helpful and a great complement that touches on a lot of the themes that the guidelines cover. So with that, thank you all so much for being here. Thanks again to our panelists for joining and for being great partners on this project, and have a great rest of your day.